Here's a guy who thinks that just presupposing that God exists defeats any atheist argument.
No, I was going to say that I myself, I'm an atheist. I have been, before I entered into studying philosophy and post-philosophy, kind of maybe more confirmed. I was curious about the quote-unquote, what people thought of Alvin Plantinga's defense of the idea that suffering or evil, quote-unquote, is a logically possible scenario for the existence of a God in relation to a world.
Plantinga's argument doesn't recognize the inherent contradiction in the idea that an all-powerful God would not have the power to create a world in which people simultaneously have free will and never suffer.
Oh yeah, but I'm happy to.
Okay, so I mean,
about it.
I'm familiar with. I think we read 2 papers in undergrad from Plantinga. I've not read this specific paper, but I would make a stronger argument from a presuppositional standpoint. So I would actually say that without theism, you can't give a coherent account of good or evil at all, which seemed to be necessary for a coherent worldview, or at least for truth values and truth propositions. And if we can't do those things, then I think we lose the possibility of meaningful language, predication, truth, etc.
This is the argument presuppositionalists use to dodge literally any challenge to theism. Jay doesn't really address the argument at hand. He reverts to dismissing any claim not predicated on theism as groundless. Presuppositionalists say that because humans are fallible and don't have the powers that God has, no human can make any claim that something is true unless there is a God that created the whole concept of truth and knows it infallibly. The problem with this is that even if there is a God who created truth and revealed it to us, we are still fallible human beings capable of thinking claims are true that are really not, and thinking claims are false that are really true. Even if there is a God who creates truth, because Jay is fallible, he still can't ground his claims as firmly as he thinks he can. Even if there is a God, Jay could still be completely misinterpreting God's nature and what God tells us through revelation. Maybe there's a God, but Christians are mistaken to think the Bible accurately describes him. Maybe God has revealed truth to us through a different book. Because we're fallible, we can't know that with absolute certainty. Because humans are fallible, whether there is a God or not, even if God does ground the very concept of truth, that ground leaves us no more capable of being certain that anything we believe is true than if there were no ground at all.
So
Yeah, well,
yeah.
I think on that, though, the problem of evil doesn't have to engage with that, because it doesn't have to give a coherent account of good and evil under an atheistic point of view, but rather has to point to the parameters in which suffering exists, assuming we consider suffering to be an evil, especially if it's unnecessary, so suffering that can be avoided. So it's not necessarily...
Yeah, but my point is that the argument, the direction that you're going, assumes value judgment standards that we should avoid suffering, etc., which are begging the question.
I don't at all assume that we ought to avoid suffering. The contradiction I see is between the existence of suffering and an allegedly loving God. If I love someone, then pretty much by definition, I'm not going to allow them to suffer unjustified suffering if I'm capable of preventing it. That is the case even if there is no objective reason why I ought to prevent the suffering. In fact, I'm not going to allow someone I love to endure suffering that I don't see as justified, even if there is an objective reason why I ought to allow it. So it has nothing to do whatsoever with the existence of objective value judgments. If God allows people to experience suffering that he has the power to prevent, I don't understand what it means to say that he's loving.
So if you're going to make arguments assuming that there are these kinds of standards, you're going to have to give an account for the standards before you can make an argument.
My argument does not assume any such standards.
So you would agree that a world in which an all-loving, all-powerful God can exist can also have gratuitous evil?
Yeah, I'm saying that there's a logical explanation for why God permitted evil, but God doesn't have to disclose to creatures what those reasons are.
If there's a logical reason to allow the evil, in what sense would it be gratuitous? One might speculate that the existence of evil is necessary to achieving some good that outweighs the evil, but why would an all-powerful God not have the power to achieve that good without allowing the evil?
And a worldview where there is a God has a basis for objective standards, and a worldview where there isn't a God can't even give an account for any standards at all.
You don't need to accept God's alleged standards to point out that it doesn't make sense that he's not following his own standards. I don't believe in objective evil, but if there is a God, there are lots of things in the world that meet the Christian standard of evil, and I don't have to agree that they are objectively evil to point out that this does not make sense.
Yeah, no, so taking that on board, so a world in which, say, bone cancer can exist in infants that die has to have a logically necessary reason according to a God that we would consider good, right?
I'm saying that you will need to give an account for meaning or value judgments at all before you can make an argument.
You don't do that, though. I know you think that good things are good because God says so, but what non-circular reason is there to think that what God says is good really is good?
In the parameters of you, so we accept the existence, and then we say things like, in the natural world, we have what appears to be suffering, pain, anguish, and we say, and this is the compatibilist view, or even a defense, that yes, these things exist. They exist. They permeate through society.
I'm making a different argument. You're trying to peg me into like normie planning a style evangelical arguments, and I'm making a
no.
Jay has only one argument, and he gets really frustrated if you try to get him to make a different one.
I'm making a broad scope conversation.
I'm making a different argument about transcendental categories and value judgments and standards.
No, I don't think so whatsoever.
I am. Again, what do you mean you don't? You said you don't think so. That's what I'm doing. What do you mean you don't think so?
Well, I don't know you, so I don't know how you will take the argument. So I can't say.
I'm telling you the argument. I'm making a different argument. I'm saying that if you're going to critique Christianity on the problem of evil, I'm saying I'd like to hear from you an account of standards, value judgments, logic, and argumentation on an atheist paradigm before I will listen to you making the arguments, because in order to make those arguments, you need to give an account for those standards.
You don't have to give an account of objective moral standards if you don't believe in any such standards. You can completely reject any and all objective moral standards and still point out that it is paradoxical that the world God allegedly made doesn't meet God's own alleged standards. Saying that atheists can't give an account of moral standards is a dodge. It's a way of avoiding addressing the paradox. Another way that Jay mentioned is to simply say God has his reasons and he's under no obligation to explain them.
Now, hold on.
No, this
yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
A different way, right? You build a bridge, right? And I critique the foundations of your bridge, right?
I just gave you the reply. You're not listening. You're not listening.
Me then having to presuppose my own.
If you're not going to listen, I'm going to boot you. So I already replied to that. How I would, on a Christian paradigm, give an account for evil. And I'm saying that in the Christian paradigm, that's not inconsistent. We might not like that answer, but it's not a logically inconsistent answer in the Christian paradigm.
Yes, it is. Even if God allows evil because it serves some purpose good enough to make up for it, that evil is still not justified because this all-powerful God would have the power to achieve that purpose without allowing evil. If a doctor can cure a problem with surgery or with medication that has few or no side effects, the surgery is not justified.
To say that God has a morally sufficient reason why he permits evil, but he doesn't tell us why that is the case.
If God is all-powerful, it is logically impossible for him to have a morally sufficient reason to permit evil.
That itself is not inconsistent if Christianity is the case. And then I'm flipping the question to you and I'm saying, on what standard do you give an account for prior questions like logic itself if you're an atheist?
Logic is a description of what kinds of statements seem comprehensible to us and what kinds of statements don't. It is not a spooky, woo-woo metaphysical phenomenon. It's a set of rules that describe an aspect of how our brains work. We have no reason to believe that it has any kind of non-physical ontology.
Well, okay, that's absolutely fine. So if we're going to presuppositional apologetics, there's no necessary reason why I should assume that only a theistic understanding of the world has an account of logic.
Sure there is.
No, there isn't, because I gave a much more coherent account of logic than theism does. The idea that there must be a God to impose the rules of logic on the universe would mean that without a God, all contradictions could be true and all tautologies could be false. That's utterly incoherent.
It doesn't exist.
I mean, you're laughing about it, but yeah, I'd be glad to argue that case to you.
I'm happy to move off the problem of evil to presuppositional logic, but that's absolutely fine by me. I will say, though, that the ball is in your court to argue that not just logic as a foundational aspect can only exist under theism, but that it can only exist under theism. I can posit a world with an internal logical structure without the existence of a theistic God. There's no presupposition
the fact that you can posit
less
that
likely than yours.
The fact that you can posit that does not mean that you can ground or give an account for it, because logic doesn't operate on its own.
That's right. It's something that brains do. What would it mean for something non-physical to do it?
So it utilizes other transcendental categories for it to be the case. And so the argument is actually that are you going to let me finish the argument? Are you going to let me finish the argument, or are you going to keep interrupting? So the argument is that all of those transcendental categories, which interrelate and interconnect with one another, are necessary for the possibility of knowledge, the possibility of ethics, and the possibility of epistemology at all.
Logic describes aspects of how the brain forms concepts and relates them to each other, but why does this require a God to occur? Why would it even necessarily apply outside of people's brains? Maybe there are aspects of reality that we will never be able to understand because the logic by which our brains operate can't effectively model them. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.